The worst part about a soundproof room is not that no one can hear you scream, but that you cannot hear what is coming for you until it is right against the glass. I remember the digital clock on the wall of the private sauna suite glowing a faint, clinical blue as it ticked toward 11 p.m. I had paid a premium for the late-night deep silence package at this luxury wellness center, wanting nothing more than to escape the noise of the city for 90 minutes of absolute isolation. The suite was a marvel of modern architecture, featuring a private cedar sauna, a cold plunge pool, and a heavy, sound-insulated door that required a keycard to open from either side. As I sat on the wooden bench, the heat began to roll over my skin in thick waves, and for a moment, I actually felt safe. But then, the primary lights in the hallway outside my suite flickered once and died, leaving only the dim, blue glow of my room and the thin strip of light coming from beneath the door. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, because I knew that the facility was supposed to be fully staffed until midnight. Why would the lights go out in a 5-star spa unless someone had intentionally cut the power to the main grid? I stepped out of the sauna, the cool air of the private lounge hitting my damp skin like a physical blow. The silence was so heavy it felt like it had weight, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear the rhythmic thrumming of my own blood. I walked toward the heavy door, reaching for my keycard on the marble table, but my hand stopped mid-air. From the other side of the thick, frosted glass door, I heard a metallic click. It was the sound of the electronic deadbolt being manually engaged from the outside. Someone had just locked me in. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it didn't budge. I pressed my face against the glass, trying to see into the dark hallway, but the frosting on the pane made everything look like a blurry, gray nightmare. Then, a shape appeared. It was a tall, distorted shadow that didn't move like the spa attendants I had seen earlier. This figure was slow, deliberate, and stood perfectly still just inches away from me on the other side of the glass. Who would be standing in a pitch-black hallway at 11 o'clock at night, watching a locked door? The shadow moved, and I heard the faint sound of a chair being dragged across the tile floor outside. My breath hitched as I realized the intruder wasn't trying to get in yet. They were settling in to wait. They knew I had nowhere to go. The suite was windowless, reinforced with soundproofing foam and heavy stone, designed to keep the world out, but now it was keeping me in a cage. I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon, but a luxury spa is not designed for combat. There were only plush towels, glass bottles of expensive essential oils, and the heavy volcanic stones sitting in the sauna heater. I went to the phone on the wall, the one meant for ordering room service or requesting more water, but when I lifted the receiver, the line was dead. Not just silent, but physically cut, the cord hanging limp like a dead snake. How long had this person been planning this? Did they follow me here, or were they lurking in the service tunnels of the building, waiting for a lone client to trap? Minutes felt like hours as I sat on the floor, tucked away in the corner where I couldn't be seen through the door's glass insert. I watched the shadow of the person's feet under the door. They were wearing heavy, mud-caked boots, entirely out of place in a sterilized, barefoot environment like this. Every few minutes, I would hear the clink of metal against metal, like someone playing with a set of keys or perhaps a folding knife. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable, and the heat from the still-running sauna was making the small room stifling and humid. I began to wonder if the person outside was waiting for the heat to overwhelm me, or if they were just enjoying the terror they knew I was feeling. Why hadn't they spoken? Why hadn't they made a demand? The lack of a motive made the situation 1,000 times more terrifying because it meant the cruelty was the point. Suddenly, the scratching began. It was a slow, rhythmic sound of a sharp object being drawn across the wood of the door. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was as if they were marking their territory, or perhaps counting down the seconds until they decided to come inside. I knew I had to do something before my panic turned into total paralysis. I looked at the sauna heater, the red-hot stones glowing with a dull, angry light. An idea began to form, a desperate, dangerous plan that required me to act with perfect timing. I moved silently back into the sauna and grabbed the heavy wooden bucket used for pouring water onto the stones. I filled it to the brim with the ice-cold water from the plunge pool, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly spilled it. If I could create enough of a distraction, maybe, just maybe, I could catch them off guard when they finally opened that door. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of someone who had reached a decision. I heard the keycard reader beep. Red light, then green. The lock turned with a heavy thud. I retreated into the back of the sauna, crouching behind the wooden benches, my heart feeling like it was about to burst through my chest. The main door to the suite creaked open, and the heavy boots stepped onto the marble floor. I could hear their breathing, heavy, ragged, and excited. They walked slowly toward the sauna, the heat of the room acting like a beacon in the cold, dark suite. I held the bucket tight, my knuckles white, waiting for the shadow to darken the glass door of the sauna itself. As the intruder reached for the sauna door handle, I didn't wait. I stood up and flung the entire bucket of ice-cold water onto the pile of white-hot volcanic stones. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A massive, blinding cloud of scalding steam hissed upward, filling the small cedar room in a split second. It was a loily on steroids, a wall of heat so intense it felt like it was peeling the skin off my face. The intruder, caught off guard by the sudden explosion of steam and the deafening hiss, stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. This was my only window. I charged through the steam, my shoulder hitting the sauna door with everything I had, slamming it into the intruder's chest. They fell back onto the marble floor of the lounge, gasping for air in the thick, humid fog. I didn't stop to look at their face. I didn't stop to see if they had a weapon. I bolted out of the open suite door and into the dark hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold tiles. I ran toward the emergency exit at the end of the hall, the one with the glowing red sign that I had ignored earlier. I hit the crash bar, and the alarm finally shattered the silence, a piercing, beautiful scream that signaled my escape. I burst out into the night air, the cold wind hitting my damp body as I ran toward the streetlights where cars were still passing by. I didn't stop until I reached a crowded gas station a block away, sobbing as I begged the clerk to call the police. When the authorities arrived at the spa, they found the suite empty, but the chair was still sitting in the hallway, positioned perfectly in front of my door. They found a long, serrated hunting knife left on the marble table where my keycard had been. The intruder had vanished into the service corridors, leaving behind nothing but the smell of mud and the damp imprint of a hand on the frosted glass. I never went back to a private spa again. Even now, when I am in a quiet room, I find myself looking at the door, waiting for the sound of a deadbolt clicking shut from the outside. The most terrifying thing about developing film in a darkroom is not the pitch-black silence, but the way the red safety light turns every shadow into a deep, bottomless hole where something could be hiding just inches from your face. I remember the chemical smell of fixer and developer hanging heavy in the damp basement air of the old community center where I spent my Friday nights. It was nearly 1 in the morning, and the rest of the building had been locked up by the janitor hours ago, leaving me as the only soul in the windowless, concrete heart of the structure. I was hunched over the plastic trays, my eyes strained by the dim crimson glow, as I began to move a fresh print from the developer into the stop bath. The image was a candid shot I had taken earlier that day in the park, a simple landscape of a stone bridge, but as the silver halides began to darken and form a clear picture, my blood turned to ice. In the very corner of the frame, standing partially behind a tree that I clearly remembered being empty, was a man in a tattered yellow raincoat looking directly into the lens. I leaned closer, the red light casting long, skeletal shadows of my own fingers across the wet paper, and realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the man in the photo was holding a very specific object. It was a heavy, rusted pipe wrench, and his face was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin that seemed to challenge the person behind the camera. I told myself it was just a stranger who had stepped into the shot at the last millisecond, but then I looked at the next frame on the drying rack. a photo of my own front door taken just an hour before I arrived at the lab. The man in the yellow raincoat was there too, standing in the reflection of my hallway window. My heart began to pound against my ribs like a trapped bird because I realized that this person hadn't just been in the park. They had followed me home, and then they had followed me here. I was in a private, locked room in a basement with no windows and only one exit, and the realization of my vulnerability felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I stood perfectly still, listening to the drip 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 of the faucet, when I heard a sound that didn't belong in the rhythmic cycle of the darkroom. It was a soft, wet thud, like a heavy boot stepping into a puddle of spilled chemical wash right outside the heavy velvet curtain that served as the light trap for the room. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as a shadow moved across the narrow gap at the bottom of the door. Someone was standing in the outer vestibule, and they weren't making a sound, just waiting for me to emerge into the darkness of the hallway. I reached for my phone on the counter, but the thick concrete walls and the underground location meant I had 0 bars of service, leaving me completely cut off from the outside world. Why was the building so quiet? Had the janitor really left? Or was he lying somewhere in the dark, silenced by the man in the yellow raincoat? The silence was shattered by a slow, deliberate knocking on the heavy wooden door. It wasn't the frantic knocking of someone in trouble, but a rhythmic, taunting sound that echoed through the small space. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the door, my heels hitting the edge of the metal sink, and accidentally knocked over a bottle of developer fluid. The glass shattered with a deafening crack, and the liquid hissed as it spread across the floor, but the person on the other side didn't react with a word. Instead, I saw a thin, yellow sliver of fabric push through the gap between the door and the frame. It was a piece of the raincoat. They were pressing their body against the door, trying to feel the vibrations of my movements inside. I realized then that the lock on the darkroom door was a simple privacy latch, designed to keep people from accidentally ruining film, not to keep out a determined intruder. I looked around the room, the red light making everything look like it was soaked in blood, and my eyes landed on the heavy metal paper cutter on the far bench. It had a long, curved steel blade that was sharp enough to slice through stacks of cardstock, and I knew it was the only thing in the room that could serve as a weapon. I moved toward it as silently as possible, sliding my feet across the damp floor to avoid making any splashing sounds. As I reached for the handle, the knocking stopped, and I heard the sound of metal scraping against the doorframe. They were using a tool, perhaps the wrench from the photo, to pry the latch open. The wood began to groan and splinter, and I knew I only had seconds before the door gave way and I was trapped in the crimson shadows with a madman. "I know you're in there," a voice finally whispered, sounding like sandpaper rubbing against stone. "I saw you take my picture. I want the film." The voice didn't sound angry. It sounded hungry, which was infinitely worse. The door frame gave a final, violent crack, and the latch popped off, spinning across the floor. The door swung open a few inches, but the heavy velvet light curtain still obscured the intruder's view. I grabbed the paper cutter blade, unscrewing the safety bolt with frantic, trembling fingers until the long piece of steel came free in my hand. I retreated into the darkest corner of the room, behind the large format enlarger, and waited. The curtain moved. A gloved hand reached through, followed by the hem of a yellow raincoat that was dripping with rainwater and grime. The intruder stepped into the red light, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. He was taller than I expected, his face partially hidden by the hood of the coat, but that same terrifying grin from the photograph was visible in the dim light. He held the heavy wrench loosely in his hand, swinging it back and forth as he scanned the room. He didn't see me at first because I was crouched low behind the equipment, my breath held until my lungs burned. He walked toward the drying rack, his eyes locking onto the photos I had just developed. He reached out to touch the wet print of my front door, and his back was turned to me for a split second. This was my only chance to escape the basement alive. I didn't try to fight him. I knew that was a losing game. Instead, I lunged forward, not toward him, but toward the light switch on the wall next to the enlarger. In a dark room, the primary white lights are incredibly bright to allow for cleaning, and after hours in the red gloom, they are blinding. I flipped the switch and the room was instantly flooded with a searing, clinical white glare. The intruder screamed, clutching his eyes as his pupils, which had been dilated for the darkness, were suddenly overwhelmed by the light. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted past him, shoving the heavy and larger table into his path to trip him up. I dived through the velvet curtains and into the hallway, my heart hammering as I heard him stumbling and cursing behind me in the blinding room. I ran through the pitch-black hallway of the community center, using the walls to guide me toward the stairs. I could hear the heavy thud of his boots behind me, but he was still disoriented, his footsteps uneven and hesitant. I reached the heavy steel emergency exit at the top of the stairs and threw my entire weight against the bar. The door flew open, and I tumbled out into the cool night air, the streetlights of the city feeling like the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I didn't stop running until I found a patrol car parked near the local diner 2 blocks away. When the police returned to the community center, the darkroom was empty, but the man had left a final message. All of my photos had been shredded into tiny pieces, except for the one of my front door, which was pinned to the wall with a jagged piece of wood. He was gone, disappearing into the city's labyrinth of alleys, but I knew he still had the memory of my face. I moved out of that apartment the very next day, and I never picked up a camera again because I realized that sometimes, when you look through a lens, something much darker is looking back at you. There is a specific kind of loneliness that only exists in a 24-hour internet cafe at 3 in the morning, where the air is thick with the hum of cooling fans and the dim, flickering glow of 100 different monitors. I was tucked away in booth 412, a premium private streamer pod that was essentially a soundproof glass box designed for creators who needed total silence and high-speed fiber optics. The walls were lined with dark acoustic foam, and the heavy door sealed shut with a magnetic lock that only I could control from the inside using a small desktop console. I had been live streaming a horror game for nearly 6 hours, my face illuminated by the harsh violet light of my LED strips, when the first strange donation message appeared on my second monitor. It didn't have a name attached to it, just a string of numbers that looked like a GPS coordinate, followed by a single sentence that made the blood drain from my face. "The view is much better from out here." I forced a nervous laugh for my viewers, telling them it was just a dedicated troll trying to get a reaction. But my eyes immediately darted to the small glass window on the booth's door. The hallway outside was bathed in the sickly yellow light of the cafe's vending machine area, but it was completely empty. I tried to refocus on the game, but the chat was moving too fast, with several moderators pointing out that someone in a dark hoodie had been seen standing directly behind my booth in the background of my webcam just seconds before. I spun around in my ergonomic chair, my heart hammering against my ribs, but there was nothing behind me but the solid, foam-covered wall of the pod. There was no way anyone could be inside with me, and the booth was positioned against a structural concrete pillar, meaning there was no space for a person to hide. That was when the power to the entire facility suddenly cut out, plunging the cafe into a terrifying, absolute darkness. My monitors went black, the hum of the fans died instantly, and the only light remaining was the dim red glow of the emergency exit sign at the far end of the hallway. I sat frozen in the silence, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing, until I heard the distinct thud of something heavy hitting the glass door of my booth. I reached for the console to check the magnetic lock, but without power, the electronic display was dead. I didn't know if the magnets defaulted to locked or unlocked during a power failure, and that uncertainty felt like a cold blade sliding between my shoulders. I peered through the glass into the dark hallway, and my breath hitched when I saw a faint, glowing light approaching from the floor level. It was a smartphone screen, held by a hand encased in a black latex glove, and as the light got closer to my door, I saw that the phone was displaying my own live stream, which was somehow still running on a delay. I watched my own terrified face on that tiny screen, a ghost of myself from 30 seconds ago, and then the person holding the phone leaned into the light. They weren't wearing a mask, but their face was covered in heavy, dark theatrical makeup that made their eyes look like hollow pits of shadow. They didn't try to open the door at first. Instead, they held the phone up to the glass so I could see a new message being typed into the chat. "I found the breaker box," the message read. "Now, let's see how long it takes for the backup air to run out in your little box." The realization hit me like a physical blow. These streamer pods were airtight to ensure the soundproofing worked, and they relied on an electric ventilation system to pull in fresh air from the ceiling. With the power cut, the small room was already beginning to feel warm and stifling. I grabbed the manual emergency handle on the door and pulled, but the magnetic seal was stuck fast. Likely jammed by a physical wedge the intruder had slammed into the frame. I was trapped in a soundproof tomb, and the person on the other side was sitting down on the floor, leaning their back against my door and watching me through the glass like I was an exhibit in a macabre zoo. I began to panic, throwing my shoulder against the reinforced glass, but it was designed to withstand the frustrations of angry gamers and didn't even vibrate. The intruder heard my struggling and began to tap on the glass with something metallic. A screwdriver, perhaps, or a pair of wire cutters. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, a taunting reminder that they were in total control of my environment. I looked around the dark booth, my lungs starting to ache as the carbon dioxide levels began to rise, and my hand brushed against the heavy, uninterruptible power supply, the UPS battery, under the desk. It was a massive, lead-acid brick designed to keep the computer running for 10 minutes during a surge, and it was the only heavy object I had. I realized that if I couldn't break the glass, I had to find a way to jumpstart the door's electronics or create a short circuit that would force the magnets to release. I remember my father telling me that magnetic locks are held by a constant flow of electricity, and if you disrupt that flow with a massive spike, sometimes the system resets. I took the heavy power cable from the back of the computer and stripped the ends with my teeth, my gums bleeding from the effort until the copper wires were exposed. I plugged the cable into the battery backup outlet of the UPS, which was still holding a full charge, and then I took a deep, shaky breath of the thinning air. The intruder was standing up now, sensing my movement in the dark. They pressed their face against the glass, their eyes wide and unblinking, and they began to pull a long, thin wire out of their pocket. A garrote. They were getting ready to come in as soon as they grew bored of watching me suffocate. I didn't give them the chance. I lunged toward the door's frame where the magnetic strike plate was located and jammed the live copper wires directly into the narrow gap. There was a violent, blinding blue flash of light and a loud crack as the UPS discharged its stored energy into the door's circuit. The smell of ozone filled the tiny room, and for a second, I thought I had blinded myself, but then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the heavy clack of the magnetic plates losing their grip. The door swung open inward, and because the intruder had been leaning his weight against it, he stumbled forward into the booth. I didn't wait for him to recover. I swung the heavy UPS battery with both hands, catching him squarely in the side of the head with the corner of the metal casing. He groaned and slumped against the acoustic foam, the screwdriver falling from his hand. I scrambled over his legs, my heart screaming in my ears, and bolted into the dark hallway. I didn't run toward the main entrance, which I knew would be locked. Instead, I headed for the kitchen area where I knew the staff kept a heavy fire extinguisher. I grabbed the red canister and sprinted toward the emergency exit, hitting the bar and bursting out into the cool, damp air of the alleyway. I didn't stop until I saw the blue and red lights of a police cruiser turning the corner 3 blocks away, their sirens a distant, comforting wail. When the police searched the internet cafe, they found the booth empty, but the intruder had left my webcam running, powered by a portable battery pack they had brought. The final recording showed the empty booth, the scorched door frame, and a hand reaching out to turn off the camera. They never caught the person with the shadowed eyes, and I never went back to streaming. Now, I only play games in rooms with windows, and I always keep a manual lock on the door that doesn't need a single volt of electricity to keep me safe.